Hi everyone. So, back again with Caliban and the Witch. Please don't mind the fact that all my nails broke. I can't believe we're only this far. Okay, well we're about to finish this first section, I think. Yeah, we're basically about to finish that, and then we're gonna move on to the next section. Tell me why I beat this book up and it's like yellow. Sigh. Okay, the next section. Okay, we're almost here. So let's read about the Black Death and the labor crisis. Here's a little picture. Peasants took arms in Flanders in 1323, in France in 1358, in England in 1381, in Florence, Ghent, and Paris in 1370 and 1380. Hell yeah, peasants. Fuck it up. Okay, so the Black Death and the labor crisis. A turning point in the course of the medieval struggles was the Black Death, which killed on an average between 30% and 40% of the European population. Coming in the wake of the Great Famine of 1315 to 22, that weakened people's resistance to disease. This unprecedented demographic collapse profoundly changed Europe's social and political life, practically inaugurating a new era. Social hierarchies were turned upside down because of the leveling effects of the widespread morbidity. Familiarity with death also undermined social discipline. Confronted with the possibility of sudden death, people no longer cared to work or to abide by social and sexual regulations, but tried to have the best of times, feasting for as long as they could, without thought of the future. However, the most important consequence of the plague was the intensification of the labor crisis generated by the class conflict. For the decimation of the workforce made labor extremely scarce, critically increased its cost, and stiffened people's determination to break the shackles of feudal rule. As Christopher Dyer points out, the scarcity of labor which the epidemic caused shifted the power relation to the advantage of the lower classes. When land had been scarce, the peasants could be controlled by the threat of expulsion. But after the population was decimated and land became abundant, the threats of the lords ceased to have any serious effect, as the peasants could now freely move and find new land to cultivate. Thus, while the crops were rotting and livestock wandered in the fields, peasants and artisans suddenly became masters of the situation. A symptom of this new development was the growth of rent strikes, bolstered by threats of a mass exodus to other lands or to the city. As the manorial records laconically registered, the peasants refused to pay. Negant solvere. They also declared that they will not follow the customs any longer. Negant consuetudines. and ignored the orders of the lords to repair their houses, clean ditches, or chase escaped serfs. By the end of the 14th century, the refusal of rent and services had become a collective phenomenon. Entire villages jointly organized to stop paying fines, taxes, and tallage, and no longer recognized the commuted services or the injunctions of the manorial courts, which were the main instrument of feudal power. In this context, the quantity of rent and services withheld became less important than the fact that the class relation on which the feudal order was based was subverted. This is how an early 16th century writer, whose words reflect the viewpoint of the nobility, summed up the situation. The peasants are too rich and do not know what obedience means. They don't take law into any account. They wish they were no nobles. They wish there were no nobles. And they would like to decide what rent we should get for our lands. In response to the increased cost of labor and the collapse of the feudal rent, various attempts were made to increase the exploitation of work, either through the restoration of labor services or, in some cases, the revival of slavery. In Florence, the importation of slaves was authorized in 1366, but such measures only sharpened the class conflict. In England, it was an attempt by the nobility to contain the cost of labor by means of a labor statute limiting the maximum wage that caused the peasant rising of 1381. This spread from region to region and ended with thousands of peasants marching from Kent to London to talk to the king. Also in France, between 1379 and 1382, there was a whirlwind of revolution. Proletarian insurrections exploded at Béziers, where 40 weavers and cordwainers were hanged. In Montpellier, the workers in revolt proclaimed that by Christmas we will sell Christian flesh at 6 pence a pound. Revolts broke out in Carcassonne, Orléans, is that how you pronounce it? Amiens, Tournai, Rouen, and finally in Paris, where in 1413 a workers' democracy came into power. In Italy, the most important revolt was that of the Ciompi. It began in July of 1382 when cloth workers in Florence, for a time, forced the bourgeoisie to give them a share of government and declare a moratorium on all debts incurred by wage earners. They then proclaimed what in essence was a dictatorship of the proletariat, God's people, though one soon crushed by the combined forces of the nobility and the bourgeoisie. Now is the time. The sentence that recurs in the letters of John Ball well illustrates the spirit of the European proletariat at the close of the 13th century, a time when, in Florence, the wheel of fortune was beginning to appear on the walls of taverns and workshops to symbolize the imminent change of lot. In the course of this process, the political horizon and the organizational dimensions of the peasant and artisan struggle broadened. Entire regions revolted, forming assemblies and recruiting armies. At times, the peasants organized in bands, attacking the castles of the lords and destroying the archives where the written marks of their servitude were kept. By the 15th century, the confrontation between the peasants and the nobility turned into true wars, like that of the Remensas in Spain, that lasted from 1462 to 1486. In Germany, a cycle of peasant wars began in 1476 with the conspiracy led by Hans the Piper. This escalated into 4 bloody rebellions led by Bundschuh Peasant Union between 1493 and 1517, and culminating in a full-fledged war that lasted from 1522 to 1525, spreading over 4 countries. In all of these cases, the rebels did not content themselves with demanding some restrictions to feudal rule, nor did they only bargain for better living conditions. Their aim was to put an end to the power of the lords. As the English peasants declared during the Peasant Rising of 1381, the old law must be abolished. Indeed, by the beginning of the 15th century, in England at least, serfdom or villeinage had almost completely disappeared, though the revolt had been politically and militarily defeated, and its leaders brutally executed. What followed has been described as the golden age of the European proletariat, a far cry from the canonic representation of the 15th century. What? Okay. Sometimes my brain is... Which has been iconographically immortalized as a world under the spell of the Dance of Death and Memento Mori. Thorold Rogers has painted a utopian image of this period in his famous study of wages and living conditions in medieval England. At no time, Rogers wrote, were wages in England so high and food so cheap. Workers sometimes were paid for every day of the year, although on Sunday and the main holidays they did not work. They were also fed by their employers and were paid a viaticum for coming and going from home to work at so much per mile of distance. In addition, they demanded to be paid in money and wanted to work only 5 days a week. As we shall see, there are reasons to be skeptical about the extent of this cornucopia. However, for a broad section of the Western European peasantry and for urban workers, the 15th century was a period of unprecedented power. Not only did the scarcity of labor give them the upper hand, but the spectacle of employers competing for their services strengthened their sense of self-value and erased centuries of degradation and subservience. The scandal of the high wages the workers demanded was only matched in the eyes of the employers by the new arrogance they displayed. Their refusal to work, or to continue to work after having satisfied their needs, which they now could do more quickly because of their higher wages. Their stubborn determination to hire themselves out only for limited tasks, rather than for prolonged periods of time. Their demands for other perks beside their wages, and their ostentatious clothing, which, according to the complaints of contemporary social critics, made them indistinguishable from the lords. That's funny. Servants are now masters, and masters are servants, complained John Gower in Mirror de l'Homme. The peasant pretends to imitate the ways of the freeman, and gives himself the appearance of him in his clothes. Honestly, it sounds amazing. The condition of the landless also improved after the Black Death. This was not just an English phenomenon. In 1348, the canons of Normandy complained that they could not find anyone to cultivate their lands who did not ask for more than what 6 servants had earned at the beginning of the century. Wages doubled and trebled in Italy, France, and Germany. In the lands of the Rhine and Danube, the daily agricultural wage became equivalent in purchasing power to the price of a pig or sheep, and these wage rates applied to women as well, for the differential between female and male earnings was drastically reduced in the wake of the Black Death. What this meant for the European proletariat was not only the achievement of a standard of living that remained unparalleled until the 19th century, but the demise of serfdom. By the end of the 14th century, land bondage had practically disappeared. Everywhere, serfs were replaced by free farmers, copyholders or leaseholders, who would accept work only for a substantial reward. Okay. Sexual politics, the rise of the state, God forbid, and counter-revolution. However, by the end of the 15th century, a counter-revolution was already underway at every level of social and political life. Excuse me. First efforts were made by the political authorities to co-opt the youngest and most rebellious male workers by means of a vicious sexual politics that gave them access to free sex and turned class antagonism into an antagonism against proletarian women. As Jacques Rousseau has shown in Medieval Prostitution, in France, the municipal authorities practically decriminalized rape, provided the victims were women of the lower class. That still goes on today. Excuse me. In 14th century Venice, the rape of an unmarried proletarian woman rarely called for more than a slap on the wrist, even in the frequent case in which it involved a group assault. The same was true in most French cities. Here, the gang rape of proletarian women became a common practice which the perpetrators would carry out openly and loudly at night in groups of 2 to 15, breaking into their victims' homes or dragging their victims through the streets without any attempt to hide or disguise themselves. Those who engaged in these sports were young journeymen or domestic servants and the penniless sons of well-to-do families, while the women targeted were poor girls working as maids or washerwomen, of whom it was rumored that they were kept by their masters. On average, Half of the town male youth at some point engaged in these assaults, which Rossio describes as a form of class protest, a means for the proletarian men who were forced to postpone marriage for many years because of their economic conditions to get back their own and take revenge against the rich. But the results were destructive for all workers, as the state-backed raping of poor women undermined the class solidarity that had been achieved in the anti-feudal struggle. Not surprisingly, the authorities viewed the disturbances caused by such policy, the brawls, the presence of youth gangs roaming the street at night in search of adventure and disturbing the public quiet, as a small price to pay in exchange for a lessening of social tensions. Obsessed as they were with the fear of urban insurrections and the belief that if the poor gained the upper hand, they would take their wives and hold them in common. For proletarian women, so cavalierly sacrificed by masters and servants alike, the price to be paid was inestimable. Once raped, they could not easily regain their place in society. Their reputation being destroyed, they would have to leave town or turn to prostitution. But they were not the only ones to suffer. The legalization of rape created a climate of intense misogyny that degraded all women, regardless of class. 2017. It also desensitized the population to the perpetration of violence against women. 2017. Preparing the ground for the witch hunt, which began in this same period. It was at the end of the 14th century that the first witch trials took place, and for the first time, the Inquisition recorded the existence of an all-female heresy and sect of devil worshippers. Another aspect of the divisive sexual politics that the princes and municipal authorities pursued to diffuse workers' protest was the institutionalization of prostitution, implemented through the opening of municipal brothels, soon proliferating throughout Europe. Enabled by the contemporary high-wage regime, state-managed prostitution was seen as a useful remedy for the turbulence of proletarian youth, who, in La Grande Maison, as the state brothel was called in France, who could enjoy a privilege previously reserved for older men. The municipal brothel was also considered a remedy against homosexuality, which in several European towns, Padua and Florence, was widely and publicly practiced, but in the aftermath of the Black Death, was beginning to be feared as a cause of depopulation. Here's a picture of a brothel. Focus. It's not. Look there. Okay. There's a lot going on in that picture. Thus, between 1350 and 1450, publicly managed, tax-financed brothels were opened in every town and village in Italy and France. in numbers far superior to those reached in the 19th century. Amiens alone had 53 brothels in 1453. In addition, all the restrictions and penalties against prostitution were eliminated. Prostitutes could now solicit their clients in every part of town, even in front of the church during Mass. They were no longer bound to any particular dress codes or the wearing of distinguishing marks, because prostitution was officially recognized as a public service. I mean, it should be. Even the church came to see prostitution as a legitimate activity. The state-managed brothel was believed to provide an antidote to the orgiastic sexual practices of heretic sects, and to be a remedy for sodomy as well as a means to protect family life. It is difficult, retrospectively, to tell how far playing the sex card helped the state to discipline and divide the medieval proletariat. What is certain is that this sexual New Deal was part of a broader process which, in response to the intensification of social conflict, led to the centralization of the state as the only agent capable of confronting the generalization of the struggle and safeguarding the class relation. In this process, as we will see later in this work, the state became the ultimate manager of class relations and the supervisor of the reproduction of labor power, a function it has continued to perform to this day. In this capacity, state officers pass laws in many countries that set limits to the cost of labor by fixing the maximum wage, forbid vagrancy, now harshly punished, and encouraged workers to reproduce. Ultimately, the mounting class conflict brought about a new alliance between the bourgeoisie and the nobility, without which proletarian revolts may not have been defeated. It is difficult, in fact, to accept the claim, often made by historians, according to which these struggles had no chance of success due to the narrowness of their political horizons and the confused nature of their demands. In reality, the objectives of the peasants and artisans were quite transparent. They demanded that every man should have as much as another. And in order to achieve this goal, they joined with all those who had nothing to lose, acting in concert in different regions, not afraid to confront the well-trained armies of the nobility, despite their lack of military skills. If they were defeated, it was because all the forces of feudal power, the nobility, the church, and the bourgeoisie, moved against them united. Despite their traditional divisions, by their fear of proletarian rebellion. Nothing brings people together like fear. Indeed, the image that has been handed down to us of a bourgeoisie preventally at war with the nobility and carrying on its banners the call for equality and democracy is a distortion. By the late Middle Ages, wherever we turn, from Tuscany to England and the Low Countries, we find the bourgeoisie already allied with the nobility in the suppression of the lower classes. for in the peasants and the democratic weavers and cobblers of its cities, the bourgeoisie recognized an enemy far more dangerous than the nobility, one that made it worthwhile for the burghers even to sacrifice their cherished political autonomy. Thus, it was the urban bourgeoisie, after 2 centuries of struggle waged in order to gain full sovereignty within the walls of its communes, who reinstituted the power of the nobility by voluntarily submitting to the rule of the prince, the first step on the road to the absolute state. And here we are today. Fucked. Okay, that's the end of that section, and I just thought that I would be reading faster, but I wasn't, so whatever, I'm just gonna quit for today. But like, anyway, comment, like, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate your support, and I will be back with the next section, which is called The Accumulation of Labor and the Degradation of Women, Constructing Difference in the Transition to Capitalism. And it has a picture of Adam and Eve getting evicted. Okay, well, I'll see you guys next time. Love you, bye.